All right, everybody, welcome back. This is a special edition of Cinema Coach where we're talking about the TV series Warrior. I don't know what, so I know where to start, but I want to start by saying this thing is awesome. And I want to preface also by saying there will be spoilers. So, spoiler alert for those of you who have not watched the show. And if you plan to watch it, may want to tune out at this point. Well, in a few seconds, I'll tell you when the spoilers come along because I'll tell you a quick summary of the plot, where it takes place, how it starts. It's a martial arts crime drama, but the cool thing about it is it takes place in San Francisco during the 1870s and 80s. So right before the Chinese Exclusion Act comes to fruition, and it's a really cool story. It's really fascinating how the characters come together, and it's about Chinese immigration and how they're taken here in the U.S. and how things are reacted to, and the climate in that time and how ridiculous it was. And obviously, this show was fiction, written by Bruce Lee, actually. But it tackles some real issues that existed back then and still existed today. So that's the non-spoiler summary. For those of you who have not watched it, now if you don't want to see spoilers, tune out now. But for those of you who are here for the spoilers and want to hear more about it and want to talk about it, feel free to drop comments and stuff in the comment section below. But yeah, let me go ahead and jump into this thing. So let me first, again, the story is pretty cool. It's in the 1880s and 70s, and it's just these characters are thrown into this mix where you have Chinese immigrants coming to the country to work and to find their fortune and to build the dream life that they want. Right, they've been sold this American dream and they want to capitalize on that. You also have Americans who are born in America or who have immigrated here to America from Europe, right? Like the Irish, for example, and they're at odds with the Chinese. And it's a very interesting dynamic because you're looking at this thing and you're listening to them talking about the working class and how the jobs are being taken by the Chinese, and there should be American Irish jobs. And the arguments can be so thin because the Irish are from Ireland. They are immigrated from Ireland, and they're claiming that these other immigrants are taking their jobs. And some of them fought in the war. It's in the wake of the Civil War. So there's so many dynamics happening right now that are so well written, so intertwined really, really well into the characters, into the storyline, into the overall environment of San Francisco at this time. And it's blended really, really well. It could have been really botched, but they did an amazing job putting this together. So first thing I want to talk about is going to be the acting. These are largely no-name actors, and I say that not to diminish them at all, because they're amazing at what they do. They really pull this off well. But they're actors that you wouldn't have seen in major, huge things, other than maybe Joe Taslim, who plays Sub-Zero in Mortal Kombat, and there's another character named Jason Tobin, who's been in some other stuff like Fast and the Furious. He was in Better Luck Tomorrow. Other than them, there's quite a few characters who you might have seen in other passing roles here and there, but it's a really good ensemble cast of characters, and it's a really diverse cast as well. You have obviously a lot of Chinese characters, a few Vietnamese. Joe Taslim is I think Indonesian, I believe, or Malaysian. But there's also a lot of Irish characters, actual British characters, and you see the interaction between the Chinese and the Irish, and then also there's scenes with black characters who came out. Again, this is just not right after, but after slavery, and the Civil War happened, and things are still kind of cooling down from that. But there's still such blatant and obvious racism in the world, even on the West Coast, where you're thinking about California being like this amazingly woke place nowadays, right? But in reality, it still has those elements, right? Those slavery elements that still exist. And the characters, as I come in, I'll talk about the characters in a second, but they each have pieces of this environment that they interact with on a regular basis. That doesn't matter if they're Chinese, doesn't matter if they're Irish, or if they're just American accented, or if they're cops or not, right? If they're born in the South, whatever. There's one character who's from Georgia, right, who actually was from the South, and his family owned slaves, and that character is really fascinating because he's a complex character. So it's a awesome blend of characters, and you see things from all different perspectives. And that's I think the first thing I want to talk about is the perspective of this show, because the way they use language in this show is extremely, extremely fascinating and innovative, because I haven't seen anything like this before. And it may have been in other things that I've seen that I haven't seen yet. But if you know of how they've done this in the past in other TV shows or movies, please feel free to comment below and let me know where else you've seen this. But what they do is they'll have the characters speaking Chinese to each other, right? And then you'll have as a white person walks by, you'll have them speaking Chinese. And then when the white person walks away, they'll do a camera shift, and then they'll just speak English to each other. So there's no more subtitles after that point. You're just hearing them talking English without any accent. And anytime the characters are by themselves, they'll have no accent. They will speak English back and forth. But then as soon as a white person comes into the frame, or someone who doesn't speak that language comes into the frame, now suddenly they're speaking Chinese again, or they're speaking English with a Chinese accent. So it's really interesting because it's a case study in perspective, because ultimately when we have a conversation with someone in English and they don't have an accent, that's how we listen to it, right? Now, if you're having a conversation with someone else in a different language, the same way we hear accents in English, we'll hear those accents in another language if we're aware enough in those languages to hear those accents, right? But if we're talking to someone in our native language and we just talk about it normally, English being mine, but still, you don't hear the accent. You just hear the word. You hear the meaning of what they're saying. And so it'll come across maybe subtly, but you'll still be able to understand what that person's saying. It's really, really cool. And I haven't seen that before. The other thing that I want to talk about is just the coaching themes that come across in this show. And that goes right along with the character development, because one big theme in this show is going to be identity, right? And creating your own identity and owning your own identity. And so I'm going to share my screen here real quick and show you this thing here. So this is the cast here. So over here you got Andrew Kochi. He's the main character. His name is Assam in the show, and he's an amazing martial artist to start with. This is ultimately a martial arts epic. It's a Bruce Lee written film adaptation, and so understandably it's going to be a lot of martial arts involved in it, but it is phenomenal. And Andrew Koji does a great job kind of taking that Bruce Lee inspiration and making it into kind of his own. He doesn't try to copy Bruce Lee, but he does pay homage to him in a lot of different ways, and it shows really, really well. The other character is Diane Doan, who's the main character. And the way it goes, Damien, thanks for tuning in, man. I appreciate it. Yes, exactly. That was cool. Yep. What he's talking about is Young Jun, who's one of the characters, spoke English until it's a scene where he was amazed that Assam was speaking English, and then it hit you that they made it seem so seamless. Yeah, you can't really tell, right? But to Young Jun, it was crazy. Like, oh my God, Assam, you speak English. Right, but to us, we didn't really notice because we're seeing them speak English the whole time. It was interesting how they did that, how they put that together. And so as you're hearing them speak English throughout the whole thing, it's just seamless to us, right? But I think the character that for me that was most obvious with is this guy right here, Hoon Lee, who plays Wang Chao. And Chao is going to be like this like intermediary character, right? He's this like he's doesn't take sides. He's basically an opportunist across the board, right? He's going to be the guy who supplies both sides with weapons, but both sides know he's supplying both sides. He doesn't play one side against the other. He doesn't try to manipulate. He just does his own thing, and he has his own agenda, and he's trying to make it in the whole process. And he actually even helps the police, right? And so that character is one of the most complex characters in the show. Also, this one right here, Olivia Chen, who plays Atoy, she is the madam, right? She owns the bordello, like the brothel in the place. And she's probably the most she's probably the most complex character in the show. And Damien, I don't want to spoil it for you. I hope you've gotten all the way through this because I'm going to tell you what happens. But in season 2, she ends up realizing she operates this brothel under the impression that she's taking care of these girls because they're all Chinese girls who work in the brothel. And she's like, oh, I'm taking care of them. I'm saving them from the streets. I'm saving them from getting killed or getting beaten up. And then she encounters a woman who has this actual farm up in the, what do you call it? Sonoma Valley. Sorry, I can't forget these things. Sonoma Valley, right? So wine country, I think that also is something that the show does really well. It brings in historical themes that people don't realize happen. The Chinese were actually really instrumental in building Sonoma Valley and a lot of wine country, and people don't necessarily know that. And so this woman, actually she's down here, Miranda Raisin, who plays this woman named Nellie Davenport. She actually is based on a real life woman. I don't remember her actual name of the real person, but she actually would go into these Chinese brothels and save women from the brothels, and she worked with the police very closely and would take them to the wineries that she owned and would allow them to build a life for themselves and have ownership in the wineries. And it's the beginning of social work, really, is what it was if you look at that, because they didn't have social work back then. And you look at the way that the police operated back then, it was brutal. Right, they didn't really care for anyone who wasn't white. You have this one scene where Assam actually literally saves the life of a white woman, and by beating up two white guys. and they beat him up. The police beat him up, take him to custody because he's the one who caused trouble, right? And it's just the way that they put everything together. It's so well done. But back to Olivia Chang's and Atoy, the theme there is that she's in this blind spot where she believes in her heart of hearts that she's saving these girls' lives, and then she sees what Nellie does, and what that she has this, that she truly means well for these girls, and she comes initially, as a viewer, you don't know how to feel about it. You feel like, okay, well, who's this white savior chick, right? Why is she trying so hard? What is she trying to do here? Here we go again, right? But then you see that she actually does mean well. She's not just trying to do it just for show and just for whatever. She really cares, and she really wants to help them, and she does create a way to help them. And so she takes them to Sonoma Valley. She shows Atoy what happens, and Atoy breaks down because she realizes she's not been helping these girls. She's been helping herself, and it's been an excuse. And there's so many times when we as individuals today, nowadays, will create these blind spots for ourselves and have situations where we don't admit to ourselves, and we don't, we'll backwards rationalize, like, oh, I'm doing it because for some, philanthropical reason or some BS reason that we make up, that's a good reason in theory, if that's why we're really doing something. But in reality, it's more of a selfish reason. It's more of a reason that we're just trying to find and grasp at straws to justify things, right? So that's one thing that really hit really hard in terms of that being a really cool character that developed. But the other thing that I wanted to point out was also, there's one scene where in the prison scene, Damien's going to know what I'm talking about, but the prison scene where Asam's in prison, and Bill, who's one of the main, he's also a protagonist, I guess you would say, but he's on the cop side of things. He's looking at this guy. He doesn't know he speaks English, and then Asam speaks English to him. And the acting was phenomenal because you see his face change, and he's like, "You speak English?" And suddenly Asam becomes human to him, whereas before he wasn't, right? And and you see it happen even today. You listen to the way people talk about people who are not American or who just speak a different language, and they may be totally American, but they don't speak English as well as other people do, right? And the second you realize that someone speaks English or has something in common with you, they become human. And on the flip side, the way that the media, the way that a lot of people treat other people or portray other groups of people as inhuman, as less than human, is how we detach ourselves from the fact that we're killing so many people around the world, and how we treat people, even in our country, right? You dehumanize people, you make them into a thing as opposed to a person, and then you can treat them however the hell you want. And that's why slavery lasted so long. That's why this show is so powerful, because it shows you how things were back then and how things actually have, still are in some ways. You look at the way that the world operates, the way the police operate nowadays. It's not all of them, obviously, but enough of them for it to be an issue. Where you have a black guy who has a lighter in his hand, he gets shot. You have a white guy carrying an AK-47, literally shooting people in the street, and he gets high-fived. What's that about, right? I mean, how much more obvious can you get, unless they were literally right next to each other, which I'm sure probably would happen at some point or has happened in the past. But there's so much going on in this show as well, which with regards to Buckley, who's this guy over here, this guy right here, also an amazing actor. He plays one of the government agents in the movie, but he's secretly manipulating both the Tongs, the Chinese gangs, against each other, right? He's trying to pull some strings and make sure that they keep fighting, because he has an agenda. He wants to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. He wants to get things going, right? So he's making sure that he can manipulate things and behind the scenes to keep the Chinese at war with each other, so that he can point to that and say, look at how bad they are. Look at how horrible they are for our country. We need to kick them out. We need to make sure that they can't get jobs. We need to push them out as much as possible. And you have he's manipulating Mai Ling, who's ultimately Asam's sister, and she's in charge of one of the Tongs, one of the powerful Tongs, and he's manipulating her to do whatever he wants to do. The scene where Asam and Bill, and the scene with Asam and Leary, where he asked him, did he have kids and was he born in this country? Yeah, phenomenal, amazing. Yep. So Leary is another character who, again, he's a sympathetic character to a point until you realize he's a racist asshole, right? But he's Irish. He's straight up from Ireland. Was not born in the U.S. He immigrated here just like Asam did, but he considers himself more American than Asam did because he fought in the war, or whatever reasoning he has behind that. Ultimately, it's because he's white, right? Because these guys, anyone who's Irish is white, and ultimately that makes more sense to them. But the thing about the show is it's so layered. There's so many different layers, and it's so applicable today, even 200 years later or 150 years later. It's still applicable. It's still exactly the same stuff happening, just in different ways, and just portrayed in different ways, to different groups of people. Look at how much racism is still happening in this country against Black people, against Asian people, against people of all colors and creeds, right? And you have just ultimately you have the little manipulators happening too, right? Where you're trying to pit everyone against each other to keep the people in power, and that's happening in this show as well. And you see it happening. You don't see it happening in real life as much. If you look for it, you can, but you don't see it as much. But the more that you delve into things, the more you see that the more divided we are, the more we fight against each other and find reasons to divide ourselves. And this is something that I'll call it the Indian community, because I know it happens in the Indian community prevalently, right? If you're not the right kind of Indian and from the right place in India, and actually believe in the exact same stuff, or the same kind of Indian you are, then there's a problem. How stupid is that? It's the most asinine, backwards ass thing in the world. But we still do that nowadays. And there's a lot of cultures that do that kind of thing, right? We try to find ways to divide ourselves instead of finding ways to bring ourselves together. And that's, again, another thing with this show. I loved the finale, or the episode right before the finale, or the finale. I can't remember which one it was at this point, but where everyone comes together. All the Chinatown gangs have to come together to defend Chinatown, because that was where they set aside things. Because you know what? It's like this impending doom. But does it have to get to that point for us to do that? Hopefully not. Anyway, I'll get back to the show. But yeah, so Mai Ling has an alliance with Buckley, and Buckley's manipulating her. He's trying to get her to do his dirty work, because he wants to shut down Chinatown. He wants to get everybody out of here. And he doesn't tell her that. He just tells her he wants her to cause violence, and he'll help her to achieve her goal, which is her taking over her town. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's very small, because and they call it out in the show as well. They say she's the queen of that town, but she leaves Chinatown. Then who is she? And there's actually a scene where, or an entire episode actually, where Assam and Young Jun go into the Wild West. And it's actually a really cool Western episode. But that's where I think that was where Young Jun finds out that Assam can speak English. But it was just it was a cool episode. It takes them out of Chinatown into the real world. And you have the racism of the real world. You have the situation where a Chinese guy actually built a tavern and actually is successful relatively, right? And it's one of those things where you see this thing happening, but he has to pretend like the white woman, his wife, who he fell in love with, owns it, because he can't pretend to be the owner. He can't let anyone know that he's the one who owns it. It's a really interesting way to look at things. Go ahead, Damien. Not to instruct. No, you're good, bro. Don't worry about it. The way they lynch Jacob and go to Chinatown and start chaos without recovery was ridiculous. Yeah, like you said, some things occurring today. I don't know about you, but I when I think about that scene, obviously there was no lynching that day, but there were a ton of them leading up to that day. But January 6th is what comes to mind, right? No repercussions. Yeah, they got held up at the airport, but who cares? Well, ultimately, what happened? They almost overthrew the government, for God's sake. I mean, the level of, and this show wasn't even written recently, by the way. I want to point that out. This came out, I want to say, like, it started 2019. I think 2020 was season 2, and season 3 just got renewed for season 3. It was actually canceled, but HBO Max is bringing it back, right? And so this wasn't even written recently. This was written like a couple years ago. I mean, probably longer, because Bruce Lee wrote it, so it's in the 60s and 50s. But this is also based on his experience in the 60s and 50s, having experienced the kind of racism that happens. And you look at the whitewashing and what happens in our culture nowadays, or I hesitate to use the word culture, but in our society nowadays, we whitewash everything. We cut ethnic people out of everything possible. You have to look no further than the movies like Gods of Egypt, starring a bunch of white people, right? You got The Last Samurai starring Tom Cruise. Fine, that had context and made sense in the story, but still, right? You got situations like, Kung Fu, The Legend Continues. That was supposed to be Bruce Lee back in the day, right? That ended up being David Carradine. You have situations like even that with Priyanka Chopra, when she had her first breakout role in the U.S. as whoever the hell she was in that show, the CIA show. She couldn't even be purely Indian. She had to be half white, half Indian. Why? What was the point of that? And you have whitewashing across the board. To deviate from this for a second, if you guys haven't watched Latin History for Morons with John Leguizamo, watch that, because that was a phenomenal look at how deep the rabbit hole goes in terms of removing people of color from history from the history books and their accomplishments. You look at the people like who are murderers, and rapists like Columbus. He has his own freaking holiday, right? But yet people who have contributed to this country and bled for this country and died for this country who just don't happen to be the right skin color, and they don't get the recognition that they deserve. So I could go on about this show for forever, but I don't want to take anyone too much longer of this. But I do want to call out a couple more things in terms of coaching themes. One other thing is just the overarching theme of identity in the show and owning who you are, and owning what the show, what you represent, what you want to be. A lot of it is a coming of age story for multiple characters. One of which is Atoy. Again, her realization that she's actually hurting these girls and ruining their lives, and being super selfish about this was a big turning point in the show. Now, where that goes, because I was at the end of the second season, where that goes in season 3, I don't know, but I'm curious to find out. For Young Jun, it's taking over the Tong, and he thought that this was something that he wanted to do, and he was really ready for it. And then, again, end of season 2 rocks him, because he's like, holy crap, I didn't realize all this stuff is involved in taking over this Tong and ruling this big part of history, of the Chinatown culture here, because the Tong is very serious, and his dad was in charge the whole time, and he butted heads with his dad so much, and ultimately he took over, and he's like, damn, this is a lot more serious than I thought it was. For Mai Ling, she took over her Tong, and she's trying to figure out now, okay, well, what do I go from here? Like, how do I make sure that the things are actually that can actually grow and take over Chinatown? That's her plan, is take over everything, because she wants to rule everything. And now she's at odds with her brother, and so she's ruthless. I give her credit. She's pretty ruthless in the show, and she's plays the character very, very well. One of the cool thing that I love that they do in this show is that at the end of every episode, and I don't know if they did this in the original show, in the original airing, but on HBO Max, when you watch it, after the credits, they have a little debrief with the cast about the show, about shooting that episode, what it was like shooting it, and their perspective as themselves, as the cast members, shooting those episodes, and talking about their experience and how they related to the characters and what the character was going through. And it's really fascinating to hear that point of view, because it's one of those things that you don't necessarily get to hear as much, right? You get to hear the behind the scenes here and there. You don't necessarily get to hear their direct point of view right after. It's like a director's commentary right after the show. And it's really, really cool to see. So, like I said, I can go on and on on this show, but the last character I'll say about the identity is Assam, and he's the main character, obviously, right, for many reasons. But the other characters are so well developed, it's hard to say that he's purely the main character. He still is, but the other characters are really well fleshed out. But Assam has a moment of coming to terms with who he is and who he's meant to be, when he saves a bunch of people in Chinatown during this whole big Chinatown raid that Damien talked about, and they make a mural of him, and it's obviously it's Bruce Lee, right? It's like he's dressed like Bruce Lee, he's got the nunchucks, and it's really cool. But he didn't expect that to happen. He didn't think that was going to happen. And he's like in awe. He's like, I guess that's me. And the interesting distinction between how Atoy responds to it and how Young Jun responds to it. Young Jun's almost threatened by it, because he's like, this is my city. It's my Tong. I took over. I should be the one on the mural, right? He didn't say this, but this is what he looks like, and this is how he acted. And Atoy's like proud of him. She's like, yeah, you're taking your place. This is where you belong. Like you belong to you belong being elevated. And Assam's like, I guess, I don't know. He's like, he kind of leans into it a little more towards the end of the episode. But again, the theme of this, the themes of this show, one of which is coming into your own identity, owning your identity, owning who you are, and realizing that what you want and what you want to accomplish requires you to own who you are. I think that's a really powerful one that sticks out to me. And there's a ton of other ones. I'd love to hear more of what other folks thought about it and what the themes are as you guys get out there and watch it. But if you haven't watched it yet, you got to watch it. It's one of those things where, it's the best show you've never watched, right? Like, I didn't even know this show existed until I watched the commentary for Mortal Kombat, when I saw Joe Taslim, and it's like, oh, let me check it out. He's an amazing martial artist. I'm like, this is supposed to be martial arts drama, and then it was written by Bruce Lee, so I was sold. And I was not disappointed at all. It's one of those shows where you're going to watch it and you're going to be like blown away, because right off the bat, I'd say the first 5 minutes of the show, maybe 7 minutes of the show, grabs you. And Damien, tell me if I'm wrong, but that first 7 minutes is like, holy shit, this is different. This is not what I expected it to be. It's really, really cool. It opens the opening scene is you're opening a crate onto San Francisco in the 1800s. And you're walking out as a Chinese person coming into this country. for the first time. And it's if you think about it from that point of view, how terrifying is it? There's no cell phones, there's no internet, there's no talking to people back home. Best case, you can send a letter maybe back home, but who knows how long that's going to take. That's the level of things here. That's the level of removal you are from where you are, what you're comfortable with. That's amazing to me, and that those people like that made that kind of journey like back then, and that's across the world. I mean, anyone who immigrated to this country, my parents included, and many people who are listening to this, parents made that kind of journey, right? They traveled and they didn't know the internet was coming. They didn't know that phones were going to be a thing. It was something where it's like, I don't know when I'm going to see my people again, right? Like my family, my friends. I may never see them again. That's a reality that they had to face leaving home, right? That's a reality that they had to be okay with leaving that place. And that journey wasn't like a 6-hour, 18-hour flight. It was probably a month and multiple month long boat ride. So yeah, exactly. So anyway, I don't want to make this too long. It's been 25 minutes already. It flies by when you're talking about stuff you enjoy. But this is a special edition of Cinema Coach. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button, hit subscribe on the channel. I'd love to tell you guys more about other Cinema Coach stuff. If Cinema Coach Live was good for you guys, I'd love to jump in and do another one of those and make that more of a thing. So yeah, hit the like button, hit subscribe, share with somebody who hasn't seen it or who might be interested in it. I'd love to hear from them. They're scared to think of the unknown and take the chance and come to another country to be treated like you're less than human. Exactly. 100%, man. Yeah, it's a terrifying thought. And can you imagine not even having a choice, right? Being brought over here and not having a choice of being taken away from your family, right? To be here and then now be treated like less than human, and just for generations, knowing that your kids are going to be treated that way and your grandkids and your great grandkids. I don't even know where to go from that, right? And so I think, from my point of view, my perspective anyway on it is just that it's so, we're at a place right now where it's a boiling point, and I want us to do something differently than what we've been doing. But we got to have people listen, right? And you got to have people who are willing to talk for people to listen. And some people are just tired of talking, which I get, and some people are tired of listening, which I don't get. So anyway. All that being said, thanks, Damien, for tuning in. Thanks to all you guys for tuning in. Take care, stay safe, and have an awesome weekend and awesome rest of the week. Happy Friday in advance, and take care, guys.